that you'll take the time to come back. And if you have any questions, be sure and let us know. You know, it's a hard thing to say no. Years ago, when I was just I was about 13, I had this great job. I would, I was mowing grass for this rich fella. He had a couple of good-looking daughters. That didn't hurt much, but I made a little money, and all I had to do was ride around on his riding lawnmower, and I just thought that was wonderful. But then my dad was going off to a meeting, and I wanted to go with him. And so I told him that I just couldn't mow the grass this week. I had to go. I wanted to go with my dad on that meeting. Well, I lost my job. And ever after, it's been real hard for me to say no to anybody because bad things happen when you say no. The word no is a disappointment. You know, people don't like to hear you say no. It's a response that sort of defies everybody's expectations. Can you give me a loan? Well, no, I can't. Sorry, I know you were counting on me to pay your rent, but that's not going to happen this week. We don't like to be told no. And we don't like to tell people no. It's not fun to say no to people. Yes, though. Yes is a green light. It's an allowance. It's what we want to hear. It's what we want to say. We want to say yes. And so everybody likes to hear yes. Nobody likes to hear no. It's just kind of a downer. In 2 Corinthians, the first chapter, in verse 20, Jesus says, over here, all the promises of God in him are yes. And in him, amen, to the glory of God through us. Oh, no, that's there. Everything God says is yes. Well, that's great. Well, could be you're missing the point of that passage. The passage is saying God's promises are sure. That somehow or another we can be steadfast in Jesus. Well, I hope you get that going soon, Octavio. How are we coming? Turn it off and turn it back on again. Perhaps we can encourage someone to use a ladder and clean the filter out on that, which will maybe make it work a little better. It'll take a while to go off. So, you need to realize that in spite of that passage in 2 Corinthians 1, Jesus wasn't a yes man. In fact, this morning I want to notice with you several of the occasions when he said no. One of the times when he said no was when people were defiling the temple of God. This can be found in Matthew, I'll get it right in a minute, Mark the 11th chapter and verse 16. The Bible says he would not allow anyone to carry wares through the temple. That was just over. He cleansed the temple and wouldn't allow anybody to carry their sales goods through the temple. He cleansed the temple. Now, this ought to say some things to us about our worship. You know, when worship is not what it should be, complacency is not the way to deal with that. We're all so complacent. You know, when the people called us about polling for elections, we just didn't want to talk to them. Go away. I don't want to talk to you. I don't want to change my credit card. I don't want to change my phone service. I don't want to talk to you on the phone. You interrupted dinner, go away, is sort of our answer. Well, this is one of those times when you can't just say go away. This is one of those times when you can't just be complacent and say, I'm not going to talk about this. This is the time when you have to say no. When your worship is not what it should be, not as God has directed, then complacency isn't the answer. The fellow who's defiling the temple of God needs to be told rather firmly, no, we're not going to do that. We're not going to behave that way. And that's a simple idea. Leaven, we're told, needs to be purged and kept out. In 1 Corinthians, the 3rd chapter, and verse 10, he says here, according to the grace of God, which is given unto me as a wise master builder, I have laid the foundation. I hope that comes on, because everybody's looking over there to see if it comes on. Maybe we can get that on a little earlier from now on there, guys. Is it coming on? Good. We're back in business. Now then, the Spanish people will be just fine over there in that translation. You all kind of pay attention. You know, I did have to laugh this week. Alan got to telling me a story. Alan tells a lot of stories. But he was talking about the fact that, I forgot where you were. Where were you? He was out at some occasion and got stuck watching a Spanish language newscast. And everybody in the place was speaking English, so I don't know what are they saying? And Alan said, well, let me see. And Alan, who doesn't speak Spanish, said, let's see, this guy here is the president of the Bank of Mexico. They go, how do you know that? Well, I got to talking to Alan and found out that he has been reading these two charts for so long that he's learned Spanish, at least enough to sort of pick it out. Okay, having gotten that off our chest, let's go to 1 Corinthians 3. According to the grace of God, which is given unto me as a wise master builder, I have laid the foundation, another buildeth thereon, but let every man take heed how he buildeth thereupon. There needs to be some carefulness as you approach the worship of God, as you approach the organization of the church. He says, for other foundation can no man lay than that is laid, which is Christ Jesus. You know, there's a lot of people that start churches. A lot of people think they can come up with their own rules and their own directions, their own ideas. And it's not going to work. In 1 Corinthians 5, he says, your glorying is not good. Know ye not that a little leaven, you know, a lot of the errors that creep into religion started out small. They were just some little point, little thing. He says, know ye not that a little leaven leaveneth the whole lump? You know, we're going to take the communion here in a little while. Whenever I hush up, we can remember the Lord here. But I remember as a kid, every now and then in the summertime, the ladies would be distracted, and somebody would leave the communion out all week in the hot building. And you know what? When you take the lid off of that thing, it was fuzzy, literally fuzzy. Why? Well, it picked up a little bit of yeast out of the air, and there's sugar in the grape juice. And what does that do? Well, it ferments, obviously, and then it really goes blingy after a while and begins to produce what looks like cobwebs on the top of it, as best I can tell. And somebody comes in, it's one of the ladies comes, oh my, and they run back and clean everything up. He says, your glorying is not good. You know that the little leaven leaveneth the whole lump. It doesn't take much. It'll pull it out of the air after a while. There's yeast floating around in the dust. And that's enough to do the whole lump. Purge out therefore the old leaven, that ye may be a new lump, as ye are unleavened. For even Christ our Passover is sacrificed for us. What he's talking about there is the Jewish women, when it became time for the Passover, would go throughout their entire house and discard everything that had leaven in it. They'd go bury it in the backyard. They'd get rid of it, because that's what he's talking about. He says, purge out the old leaven, that you may be a new lump. You've got to get rid of the leaven, or it'll influence everything, because at the Passover, they were instructed to have unleavened bread. And so he's saying to us, let us keep the feast, not with old leaven, not with the leaven of malice and wickedness, but with the unleavened bread of sincerity and truth. So when it comes to the worship of the Lord, and when it comes to the organization of the Lord's church, when it comes to what the Bible teaches, we don't have any business leavening it. Teaching our own ideas, teaching our own notions. It doesn't take a lot to make a major departure. But notice there was another occasion when the Lord said no. He said no when people just want to play with the truth. You know, there's some people that aren't serious about it at all. You might notice with me in John, the 8th chapter, the scribes and the Pharisees brought a woman to Jesus, they said, who had been caught in adultery in the very act. And man alive, I tell you what, this is the sort of stuff that they put on the evening news, don't they? Whew. People say the Bible's boring. Jesus went into the Mount of Olives, and early in the morning he came again into the temple, and all the people came unto him. He sat down and taught them, and the scribes and Pharisees brought unto him a woman taken in adultery. And when they had set her in the midst, they say unto him, Master, this woman was taken in adultery, in the very act. Now Moses in the law commanded us that such should be stoned. But what sayest thou? This they said, tempting him, that they might have to accuse him. Now the Jews hadn't stoned anybody for adultery for centuries. They just had quit doing it. But because they thought it cruel, because there might have been a lot of adultery, a lot of people getting stoned. So now they want to put Jesus in some sort of dilemma. Are you going to be cruel and say, hey, we should stone this woman? Or are you going to be merciful and violate the law? But Jesus stooped down and with his finger wrote on the ground as though he heard them not. So when they continued asking, he lifted up himself and said unto them, He that is without sin among you, let him cast a stone first at her. Again he stooped down and wrote on the ground. And they which heard it, being convicted by their own conscience, went out one by one, beginning at the eldest, even unto the last. And Jesus was left alone, and the woman standing in the midst. And he tells the woman, Go thy way and sin no more. You know, it's interesting that they were just playing with him. They weren't going to stone this woman. It's interesting that they didn't bring the man. Why didn't they bring the man? There were two of them. They were caught in adultery in the very act. Well, maybe the man was a man of some influence. And so they let him go, but the woman was perhaps a low woman, the man not being a low man, and they decided to grab her. Maybe it was just that the guy could run faster. I don't know. They couldn't catch him, but they could get the woman. But they only wanted to test Jesus to see what he would say. So that when people obviously just want to play with the scripture, just say no. No. We're not going to play with this. Let me show you 2 or 3 passages that talk about it. First of all, 1 Timothy 1 and verse 4. This series is in Timothy and Titus. Paul says, neither give heed to fables and endless genealogies which minister questions, rather than godly edifying, which is in faith, so do. He says again in 1 Timothy 6, verse 4, he is proud, knowing nothing, but doting about questions and strifes of words, whereof cometh envy, strife, railings, evil surmisings. In 2 Timothy 2, verse 23, foolish and unlearned questions avoid, knowing that they do gender strifes. And finally, in Titus 3 and verse 9, avoid foolish questions and genealogies and contentions and strivings about the law, for they are unprofitable and vain. There comes a time in Bible discussions say, no, you're not really sincere about this. You're not really interested in the truth. You just want to quibble and argue and fuss. You know, I always get worried about people who insist on being the devil's advocate. Well, you know, he's doing just fine. He doesn't need your help. Thank you very much. Why are you the self-appointed devil's advocate? But again, let's notice another time when he said no. You know, sometimes people are just not being honest. They're just not being honest. For instance, in Matthew 21, when he was come into the temple, this is in verse 23, when he was come into the temple, the chief priests and the elders of the people came unto him as he was teaching and said, by what authority doest thou these things? And who gave thee this authority? Jesus answered and said unto them, I will also ask you one thing, which if you tell me, I likewise will tell you by what authority I do these things. The baptism of John, which was it, from heaven or of men? They reasoned among themselves, saying, if we shall say from heaven, he will say unto us, why did you not then believe him? But if we shall say of men, we fear the people. For all hold John as a prophet. And they answered Jesus and said, we can't tell. And he said unto them, neither tell I you by what authority I do these things. They weren't being honest. He answered them with a question. They refused to answer his question. That revealed just how wicked they were. They wouldn't answer. And thus he refused to answer theirs. You and I need to learn by that example. Sometimes people are just not being honest in their dealing with the scriptures. But in another time, Jesus said no to reflect his family. You know, sometimes you just have to say no when your family tries to pull you away. Now, this is very hard for a lot of new Christians or people who are thinking about Christians, being Christians. Jesus' mother and his brothers came seeking him, not as his disciples, but probably wanting him to stop what he was doing. The incident can be found in Mark, the 3rd chapter. Let's begin reading, say, in verse 20. Then Jesus entered a house, and again a crowd gathered, so that he and his disciples were not even able to eat. When his family heard about this, they went to take charge of him, for they said he is out of his mind. You can imagine enormous crowds, Jesus terribly busy so that he doesn't even have time to eat. But then again in verse 31, then Jesus' mother and brothers arrived. Standing outside, they sent someone in to call him. The crowd was sitting around him, and they told him, your mother and brothers are outside looking for you. Who are my mother and my brothers, he asked. Then he looked at those seated in a circle around him and said, here are my mother and my brothers. Whoever does God's will is my brother and sister and mother. Sometimes our family fights against us as Christians, doesn't want us to become Christians, doesn't want us to change. We've been members of this you put in the denomination for years, your mother and your grandmother, your great-grandmother, we were all members of this denomination, and now suddenly you've discovered some new truth in the Bible and you want to quit. Well, yeah. And so they envy and fuss and complain and give us difficulty. They're testing you. They're trying to take you away from the disciples, and you're going to just have to say no. No, I'm not out of my mind. No, I still love you, but I'm going to follow Jesus in what the Bible plainly says. There's a real good example of this in Luke 14 and verses 26 and 27. He says here, if anyone comes to me and does not hate father and mother, wife and children, brothers and sisters, yes, even their own life, such a person cannot be my disciple. And whoever does not carry their cross and follow me cannot be my disciple. Now that's pretty extreme, isn't it, to say you've got to hate your father and mother? I don't suppose it's actually saying that we have to hate them, but we have to put them second. And anybody you put second is lower down in that list of love. And that's, I think, what the Lord's talking about. Even your own life has to be placed second to obeying the Lord. And so Jesus exemplified that with his own family. But in addition, there is another area that we come to, and that is when the cares of this life call us. You know, we get busy every now and then. In Luke 10 and verse 38 through 42, as Jesus and his disciples were on their way, he came to a village where a woman named Martha opened her home to him. She had a sister called Mary who sat at the Lord's feet listening to what he said. But Martha was distracted by all the preparations that had to be made. She came to him and asked, Lord, don't you care that my sister has left me to do the work by myself? Tell her to help me. Martha, Martha, the Lord answered, you're worried and upset about many things, but few things are needed, or indeed only one. Mary has chosen what is better, and it will not be taken away from her. Martha wanted the Lord to tell Mary to get to work. Now, ladies, I want you to remember this come Thursday. When you've been preparing for 3 or 4 days and are thrashing around and so forth, and your daughter-in-law, or sister, or somebody just sitting there in a living room watching football with the guys, you want to say, hey, get in here and help me a little bit, sling this ash. The Lord's answer on this occasion was no. No. She doesn't need to be helping you. Maybe you don't need to be doing what you're doing. And so a lot of times in life, work needs to be told no. No. Rick was telling me, Rick sort of takes our attendance. We don't ask, Cindy, are you here? We don't take attendance that way. But we do like to know, because we don't want anybody to slip away and we didn't pay attention. And that can happen. But he was telling me about a lady that's a member here that hasn't been here for 3 months. And he says, where in the world is she? And I said, well, the last I heard about her, she said she had a job and she had to work on the Lord's Day. Well, sometimes you just have to say no. You have to get another job. You have to move on. You have to say, look, I'll be in there at 12 o'clock. I need to leave at 10 o'clock. I'll be back at 12 if you need me that bad. But I need to worship the Lord. It was true in the Old Testament, and it's true today. But in addition, and the last one that I want to talk about, Jesus said no when a man wanted to follow him. He said no. It's interesting. That's the passage that Steve read to you as we began this lesson. It's in Luke 8. It's the man whose name was Legion. It's sort of a heartbreaking thing. The man had been delivered of a legion of demons. And now we see him, or you saw him at the end of this reading, clothed and in his right mind, talking with Jesus. Others, all of the people in that area, wanted Jesus out of there. Please leave town. He had caused the herd of swine, or he had caused them, the devil had caused the herd of swine to run to the sea, but they were sure blaming Jesus. So they wanted him out of there. He's kind of costing them money. But this man doesn't. This man, Jesus prepares to leave, and he wants to be with him. Let me go with you. And Jesus says no. He says no. Jesus doesn't permit him. When he got into the boat, he who had been demon-possessed begged him that he might be with him. What Jesus told him was, go home to your friends and tell them what great things the Lord has done for you and how he has had compassion on you. That was sort of a heartbreaking no. What do you mean, no? I can't go with you? No. Sometimes the door's there, but it's just closed. It's not the right time. And sometimes maybe you just need to go home and begin at home. I remember, I think I've told you this story in years gone by when I first came to the church here. Oh, I hadn't been here 2 weeks, and a young man came over that had just been baptized a week before. And he said, John, I want you to teach me how to be a preacher. I said, you've only been a Christian for a week. Maybe you could kind of work on that for a little while. Work on that Christian thing for just a little while. And then we could talk a little later about your becoming a preacher. Sometimes there needs to be a little growth. There needs to be a little growth. And so, this morning, the Lord has told you no on many fronts. But I'll close here by talking about one of the areas where he has told you absolutely yes. It's over in Acts, the 10th chapter. He says, Peter opened his mouth and said, of a truth, I perceive that God is no respecter of persons, but in every nation he that feareth him and worketh righteousness is accepted with him. He's saying yes to you. There's a lot of areas where he said no. But to you this morning, if you're not a Christian, he's saying absolutely yes. Will you follow him? Will you work righteousness? Believing, will you repent of your sins and confess him and be baptized? Then come while we stand and sing.